Welcome to Education 1.5, whereby we continue our discussion on the Education Amendment Act. And today we are discussing on the issue of registration of non-government schools. My name is Clement Lizio and I'm your host. To discuss this topic, I'm joined today by Mr. Gwatizo and Tendai Nyamajiwa. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Mr. Gwatizo, maybe to start the discussion, what do we call a school?
In general terms, we would call a school a learning environment, a learning platform where pupils are gathered and provided with learning guidance and instruction towards stated outcomes and within a defined curriculum.
Does it mean that a school can be a school without premises, Tendai?
Yeah, for me, I think school can be without premises because we think of learning beyond the school environment, beyond the buildings. It has to do with the learning environment that is offered. So you see that even a child, as they grow up within the home, even if they before they are introduced into the formal school environment, they are already learning from home. They are already learning within the home with the parent, with the father, with the mother. So learning in the school environment goes beyond that.
Let's go to the Education Amendment Act now. There's different categories of schools. Non-government and government school. Can we clear that before we go further into the discussion?
In the Education Amendment Act, there are schools which are owned and run by various tiers of government, central government, local government, and these are the schools which are collectively known as government schools within the Education Amendment Act. And then the rest are being grouped as non-governmental schools, even though there is no homogeneity within the non-governmental schools. You have faith-based schools, schools run by churches, which are grouped in those non-governmental schools. You have schools which have traditionally been known as trust schools or private schools, which are also grouped within that grouping of non-governmental schools. But it's important to understand that legislation always lags behind reality. That categorization of schools is actually harking back to an era before what is emerging now, because schools are not necessarily either government or non-governmental schools. Within those classes you will find, especially in the non-governmental grouping, there are profit-making schools, there are non-profit making schools, there are home schools, as we already alluded to. So the categorization of schools needs to be revisited to inject greater degree of flexibility of the emerging nature and diversity of schools as we have talked about them.
Yes, you're bringing in something that is interesting, and Tendai might need to come in when it comes to the issue of registration of ECD schools. You might need to come in and clarify.
So with the registration of ECD centers, you see that the government has set up a standard whereby you have to meet a certain criteria before you're able to register for a center. So this has been a hindrance for many centers if they don't fit the given criteria. So it has given a platform where the ministry has become flexible in accepting schools that really don't fit the criteria but then fit a certain standard, so that they are taken under the wing of the ministry and to standardize quality provision of ECD learning.
So that brings us to us having registered schools and non-registered schools. Don't you go away, we'll continue our discussion. You heard them, they spoke about the definition of a school, to say a school does not really mean a premises, but it's a learning platform. Watch out for the next segment. Welcome back. This is Education 1.5, whereby we continue our discussions on the Education Amendment Act. In the last segment, we spoke about a school, to say what is a school. What are the process that should be followed for one to register a school?
The ministry, they require a minimum set of land, minimum development in infrastructure, minimum staffing levels, adherence to curriculum. When you've met those requirements, you then present yourself to the district office or the provincial office where your school is established, applying and seeking registration. The purpose of registration must also become material, because you're registering in looking to communicate a certain authenticity and quality of your institution, which the ministry is meant to inspect and then certify. And because the original registration criteria was quite high and stiff, we ended up having lots of non-registered institutions mushrooming.
What do you mean when you say quiet and stiff? Maybe
Yeah.
you can explain further.
Because the acquisition of the land, the construction of the infrastructure prior to registration was not something that every founder of a school was able to immediately meet.
Okay.
But there would be still a market to fulfill, children to bring into these schools. And so they would start by providing the learning environment and enrolling without seeking registration. And there was a cat and mouse game between the ministry and those institutions, where the ministry was trying to stamp out the growth of non-registered schools. But it came to a point where the practical reality was that the ministry really needed to be aware of those institutions, to know what their challenges were, and to guide them towards registration. So it's no longer one chasing after the other. We're now trying to cooperate and help the non-registered schools to become registered. So registration is now becoming a process where the ministry becomes aware of all learning platforms, learning institutions in the country.
Yep.
And we are seeing in the act in encouragement by the ministry that once you are registered or known to them, then you would be paying a registration fee to the ministry. To the best of my knowledge, the scales of those fees have not yet been set. But the anticipation is that registered schools or schools that are known to the ministry would end up paying a registration fee, which in essence would also support the ministry to provide services to those learning institutions.
Wonderful. Tendai, is that the same case with the registration of ECD centers?
Yeah, it is the same, and we really appreciate the process of the ministry getting to be less strict on the criteria for an ECD center or a school to register, and make it possible for more children to be accepted into school, because previously, as Mr. Kwatizo has said, we would see that children were traveling long distances to access schools, those which were registered. And there were many children that were getting into one class, maybe one teacher to 80 students, and that would impede on quality. So we really applaud that move by the ministry to do so.
Are you aware of the fees that are being paid now?
No, I'm not privy to that.
Mr. Gotizo?
Well, to the best of my knowledge, the ministry has not yet set registration fees. The Education Amendment Act provides for the minister to set those scales, and I'm not aware yet whether the ministry has set those fees or has even started collecting those fees. For those who actually run schools, it's important to understand that the amendment in the Act makes it a criminal offense for a responsible authority of a school to fail to pay those fees.
Is it to fail to pay or to fail to register?
Yeah. Well, once you're, as I said, we are witnessing a degree of flexibility. Once you're known to the ministry, we can extend that to say registered. So there will be fees attendant to that. And it is those fees that, if you are a responsible authority of an institution, you are expected to ensure that those fees are paid. And if you don't pay those
in
fees,
actual fact, you're saying you are considered registered when you've paid the registration fee.
let's wait for the subsidiary registration to that amendment. We don't want to go ahead of the ministry and prescribe what they're doing. We're actually anticipating that as part of the implementation of the Education Amendment Act, the ministry will send out subsidiary legislation, regulations, or statutory instruments, or even circulars. That is where we will take it up from.
Tenda, you might need to come in there.
You see that within that area of registering, there are issues to do with ECD centers that are struggling, or schools that are struggling, given the economic conditions in which we are operating. Then you have to raise concerns about how schools are then going to survive. How are they going to pay the annual subscription to the ministry? Those are some of our concerns.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. On the issue of it being a criminal offense, how many years does the law prescribe?
Most legislation stops at stipulating the level of the fine, and if my memory serves me well, it will be level 6, which is not a small level. It's actually quite significant. But it's important when you talk about the registration of ECD centers to also share the view that government took when they decided that what we've traditionally known as primary schools, starting from grade 1 to grade 7, must now become schools that also have ECD-A and ECD-B, so that the span of primary education expands from 7 years to 9 years. So we are anticipating that with this evolution, because it should never be stagnant, change must continue to visit education, particularly with the impact of technology. We should see that there is increasing room for ECD centers to exist in association with traditional primary schools, rather than as strictly appendages to the primary schools. ECD is really a specialized area, a very important area, a formative area for everybody that is going to go into education. And the level of attention that they would get when they just become the first 2 years of primary schools is very different. It's very different. We are witnessing this, in that the number of unqualified teachers at ECD levels is higher than the number of unqualified teachers in other grades. And yet, it is our view, certainly my view, that the most important area of education is that initial period. Those initial years, 0 to 5 years, are critical.
In other words, we are saying when you're registering a school, you must then consider as a precondition to say you should have an ECD center, or what? Should start at ECD or what?
The direction of the ministry is that way, that there must be an ECD as well. But I was expressing hope that we would engage to ensure that ECD centers will continue to have an existence of their own.
Thank you, Mr. Gwedizo, and today for the wonderful discussion. Don't you go away. This is Education 1.5, whereby we are discussing the Education Amendment Act, and today we are discussing the issue of registration of schools. You heard them. They said they welcome what the law provides in terms of registration of schools and the practical ways that the ministry is putting in place to make sure that schools are registered. Welcome back. This is Education 1.5, whereby we continue discussions on the Education Amendment Act, and today we are discussing on the registration of non-government schools. Mr. Gwetizo, there is a mushrooming, especially in urban centers, of unregistered schools. What's your comment on that in terms of policy?
Well, government policy is clear. Anyone who intends to provide a learning service has to register. but there is a demand for schooling services which is not being met. Whether it's because people are finding that schools are far away, or they're finding that the level of school fees or the classroom sizes are not to their liking, then sometimes parents are forming their own schools in homes.
Backyard schools.
Or entrepreneurs are seeing business opportunities to provide these schools, which, as we alluded to earlier, they then don't immediately meet the requirements for registration.
Yeah.
And so this is what you were describing as the mushrooms of mushrooming of backyard schools.
Yeah.
The schools being provided in unsuitable facilities. Some of them have got untrained teachers. Some of them have got because they're not registered, they've got no routes to examination, no clear routes to examination, and often end up going to registered schools looking to have their children registered for exams. So it is a growing problem, but we must also recognize that it is a result of a need. And government is on record saying they have a shortage of nearly 2,000 schools and that they would like to construct.
Yeah.
So when you have got that kind of shortage, and when you have a mentality amongst parents that is looking to enter established environments, you're going to find this growth of backyard schools. It is a problem, but it is also a solution for some.
Do you agree to this?
Yeah, I really do agree in the sense that for me, then I would have to scrape the wording mushrooming of backyard schools. That sounds like a negative word which denotes to a lesser standard of schools. It's possible that they might be able to fit the criteria as they go on. So for me, I would think that we need to advocate that the government or the ministry embraces these schools and then they go on the same table and we think along the lines of
But I thought
solution.
the purpose of registering is for you to meet certain standards. And do these backyard schools meet those standards that are being expected by the ministry?
Like Mr. Gwatidzo was saying, there's that shortage for schools. Like it's a reality for us. Children are walking long distances to school. The classes are overcrowded. So there's definitely a need to expand our schools. So maybe we need to think outside the box, outside the traditional way of schools and the established school premises.
But does shortage of schools then entails that we should have substandard schools?
Definitely.
Well, come back to reality, if I may come in, and look at a farming community recently resettled, or a housing estate recently established. There's need for kids in that community to attend a school today, not tomorrow.
Yeah.
And therefore, someone comes along and wants to provide learning to those children. The parent then is faced with the stark choice of whether their children must walk 12 kilometers to the nearest registered school, or whether they will take this school to this community unregistered school. Now, the imputation of registration that is necessarily brings quality, that has to be tested, because one can have a school that's not registered, that's actually providing a quality learning environment. The important thing is the official process of registration needs, as Tendai was saying, to open a track where people can go through a gradual process to achieve registration, rather than to make registration a prerequisite of the provisioning of education, because we will only be creating a problem for which we have no solution.
So how do parents know that this is a registered school or this is an unregistered school?
So definitely a registered school will have to display their registration certificate within the office of the headmaster or the administration building. But then at times they might not be able to see that, and then there are questions as to why and is there a registration there.
And why is it important for parents to take their kids to a registered school?
The presumption is that the parents care whether a school is registered or not.
Yeah.
You know, move it from schools a bit and just take it into money changers. You know, they are the registered money changers, the Bureau to Change, and they're the unregistered ones who, you know, are all over the streets. And you still see people coming in and going to those unregistered people, and there are risks attendant to that, but there are benefits to them. So you're going to see parents making decisions of where to place their children. And it's important that we don't always look to prescribe, but to facilitate a process where every child gets access to quality education. And when rules and principles start to encumber that process, then that is certainly the signal that they need revision.
So to you, the important aspect that a school must be known within the ministry, so that they monitor whether the school is providing quality education or not.
No, that is not the important principle. The important principle is everyone who wants to learn must have access to a learning environment that provides quality learning. And if we hold that as the holy grail and everything follows that, then we will not have a situation where we criminalize people who are providing a service that is needed.
I see you're itching to come in.
So I agree with Mr. Gwatidzo in the sense that then we speak of progressive realization of the right to education.
Absolutely.
So if we're going to have an open discourse between the ministry and schools, then we are going somewhere with the private schools, the non-registered private schools. That's my thinking.
That's fantastic.
Yes, it's important, especially as we talk about the Education Amendment Act, that we don't look at legislation as something that drops from heaven. Legislation is something that we create. And having created it, we mustn't see it as something cast in concrete. We must see that there's a continuous review of legislation and amendment of that legislation towards the goal that we all want. And in this case, it is quality learning for all children. And it is my hope that with the lobbying that civil society does, with the openness that the government has shown, and the historical interest in the nation as a whole in promoting education, that these conversations lead to increased acceptance of the different types of schools, particularly now because e-learning has come in. And we need to be making sure that we're getting the outcomes that we want for each child from those e-learning environments. We need to make sure that even our teacher training institutions are responding to the new needs that are coming in, the new teachers that are coming in. So this is a time of momentous change that we must embrace.
There is an issue, Mr. Gwatidzo and Tendai, of the government categorizing to say these are non-government schools, these are government schools, and there is an issue of faith-based schools receiving grants in terms of support to the salaries of teachers, which the private schools are not getting yet. They're all in the category of non-government schools. What's your comment on that?
Ideally, all children, all learners must be benefiting from the state-funded education that is provided for, indeed, in the Education Amendment Act, for a basic education, starting ECD to O levels. So in an ideal, well-resourced environment, we don't expect that government would withdraw grants from private schools. Because what is government after all? Government is the collective basket into which all of us pour in resources so that those resources can be applied across the board to benefit everyone. So there is really only a practical consideration which was taken in the budget statement of I think 2015 when the government grants were withdrawn from private institutions. But otherwise all schools should be benefiting from government grants. And when you talk specifically of faith-based institutions, we will need to unpack that further, because these are certainly institutions with an agenda beyond learning, which is the faith. And we would want to say, do we want to support the propagation of one faith against the other? And if you look in this country, the majority of the faith-based institutions are of a Christian nature, but there are also an increasing number of an Islamic nature. Then you have the traditional belief system, traditional faith, which don't really have any. And yet, if you look at the practitioners in that area, they are in the majority.
You are bringing a very important issue that we might need to tackle in the next episodes. As we are wrapping up, Tendai, do you have any concluding remarks?
Whatever our work is has to be premised on quality access for every child. So whatever advocacy points that we're going for, whatever procedural issues that come up, they have to be in the best interest of the child, for every child to get access to quality education.
Thank you, Tendai. Thank you, Mr. Gwatidzo. We have come to the end of this episode, and we have been discussing about the issue of registration of non-government schools, and they brought it clear to say it is a criminal offense of level 6 for you to operate a school without registering. And they have also brought it clear to say the mushrooming of unregistered schools or the backyard schools is as a result of the shortage in schools. Thank you so much. Let's meet in the next episode. This is Education 1.5, and my name is Clement Lisi.